There's footage they never wanted you to see. Samuel Noah Kramer, 91 years old, weeks from death. The man who single-handedly taught the modern world everything it knows about humanity's first civilization. He's sitting in a Philadelphia basement that smells like clay dust and dying secrets. Hands trembling over tablets older than the Bible. And he's about to say something on camera that will make his colleagues wish he'd stayed silent. Before I die, please listen. We have gotten this wrong. Not the details, the whole framework. For 50 years, this man was the authority on ancient Sumer. His word was final. His translations were gospel. And in his final days, he admitted all of it might be wrong. The academic establishment buried these interviews, but the transcripts survived. This is what they didn't want you to hear. The man who owned Sumer. Here's what you need to understand about Samuel Noah Kramer. For 50 years, this man didn't just study Sumer. He was Sumer, at least as far as the modern world was concerned. Every textbook you've ever read about the world's first civilization, his translations. Every museum exhibit explaining those wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay, his interpretations. Every academic paper, every documentary, every college lecture about where human civilization actually began. All of it traced back to the basement of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, to one man. And now I can turn it around and have a look at the writing that's been hiding underneath. So no one's seen that writing for 4,000 or 5,000 years. Yeah, the only person that's seen it previously is the one who wrote it. Surrounded by clay tablets covered in marks that nobody else could read. He deciphered thousands of them. Literally thousands. And get this, when he started in the 1920s, Sumerian was basically a dead language with no instruction manual, no native speakers, no dictionaries. He taught himself by comparing texts, finding patterns, building vocabulary word by word over 6 decades. His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced millions to a civilization most had never heard of. The first recorded love song, the first legal code, the first school system. Every time archaeologists dug up new tablets anywhere in the world, they shipped them to Kramer. He was the authority, the final word, the bridge between the modern world and humanity's deepest past. If you're as obsessed with what ancient civilizations knew that we've forgotten, subscribe now, because what Kramer discovered in his final years will fundamentally change how you see human history. So here's a man at the absolute peak of his field. Honorary degrees from universities worldwide. His translations in every textbook. Students across the globe learning ancient history from his words. But here's the catch. Kramer was never comfortable with his own conclusions. And by the end, he'd realized why. The footnotes. Nobody read it. It started quietly. So quietly that almost nobody noticed. If you went back to Kramer's academic papers from the 1960s and 70s, really read them, not just skim, you'd find something strange buried in the footnotes. Astronomical references, a moon, a star, various symbols, which even could be symbolized as a wristwatch. Technology being used 6,000 years ago. Little aids almost whispered. A particular word has no exact English equivalent. A concept is difficult to render in modern terms. Certain passages have meaning that remains obscure. Seemed like normal scholarly caution, right? Every translator acknowledges difficulties. But here's the deal. The footnotes became more frequent over the years and more troubled. By the 1980s, Kramer wrote something that should have set off alarm bells. The more I study these texts, the less certain I become about their true meaning. His colleagues dismissed him. Sam's losing it, they whispered in faculty meetings. Too long in the basement with those tablets. An aging scholar becoming overly philosophical about his life's work. Happens to the best of them. But Kramer wasn't being philosophical. He was being literal. He'd noticed something about Sumerian thought that kept him awake at night. Something that violated every assumption he'd built his career on. The Sumerian language had no word that clearly meant religion as we understand it. None. It had no distinction between natural and supernatural. It had no concept of miracle. No why. Because it had no baseline of normal for miracles to violate. The Sumerians didn't separate sacred from secular, spiritual from material. These categories didn't exist, not for them. And that word we translate as God, basically it means something closer to great power or cosmic principle. It wasn't clear the Sumerians worshipped these entities the way later cultures worshipped gods. It wasn't even clear they thought of them as beings in any sense we'd recognize. In a 1987 interview, Kramer said something that should have made international headlines. When I translate a Sumerian text about the creation of the world, I use English words like creation and world. But I am no longer convinced the Sumerians had anything like our concept of creation or our concept world. I think they might have been describing something completely different. He paused. The interviewer said his eyes looked haunted, and I have spent 50 years putting their thoughts into categories they would not have recognized. But the real crisis, it wasn't the footnotes. It wasn't the growing doubt. It was a single tablet, one he translated 40 years earlier. One that was about to break him. The tablet that broke him. This is where it gets crazy. The tablet came from Nippur, an ancient city, dated to around 2100 BCE, found decades earlier, sitting in the Penn Museum collection. They've been translated, and they tell exciting stories about how gods intermingled with human beings and actually had a hand in the creation of human beings. Kramer had published his translation back in 1949. The text appeared to be a dialogue between a human and a god, discussing the nature of knowledge and the origin of civilization. In his version, the god explains how the gods granted civilization to humanity as a gift. It fit perfectly with the established narrative. The Sumerians believed civilization came from the gods, just like the Egyptians, the Greeks, every ancient culture. Case closed, translation published, moved on. But that tablet kept nagging at him. 40 years of something feeling wrong that he couldn't name. In 1988, 91 years old, Kramer returned to it one final time. His assistant said he sat in that basement for 3 hours, just staring, turning the clay over in his spotted hands, the dust catching in his wrinkles, trying to forget his own translation, trying to see what the original Sumerian actually said instead of what he'd assumed it must say. And then he stopped breathing. The color drained from his face. For 3 full minutes, he didn't move. His assistant asked if he needed a doctor. Kramer looked up and his voice was barely a whisper. I've had it wrong, all of it, for 40 years. Here's what he discovered. The word he translated as gift. It could also mean awakening or remembering. The word he translated as human. It could mean sleeping one or unaware one. The word he translated as God. It could mean fully conscious one or aware power. You see what this means? Reread with these alternative meanings. The tablet wasn't saying the gods gave civilization to primitive humans. It was saying civilization emerged when humans awakened to capacities they already possessed, that what we call gods might have been the Sumerians' way of describing states of consciousness, modes of awareness, things we no longer access or understand. This wasn't a small reinterpretation. This turned the entire text, and potentially every text like it, completely inside out. Kramer showed it to his colleagues. Dr. William Hello at Yale, a man who'd spent 40 years building on Kramer's translations, reportedly went pale when he read the new interpretation. Sam, this would invalidate everything. My books, my students' dissertations, all of it. Dr. Miguel Civil at Chicago was blunter. You need to rest, Sam. This isn't scholarship anymore. This is a breakdown. But Kramer couldn't let it go, because once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He went back through his major translations, all the work that had made his reputation, text after text after text, and in every single one, he found the same problem. He'd imposed modern categories onto Sumerian thought. He'd made assumptions about what the text must mean based on what made sense to a 20th century academic mind. But the real shock wasn't what the tablet said. It was what Kramer realized about every translation he'd ever published. The consciousness collapse. In those final interviews, the ones they never wanted you to see, Kramer tried to articulate what he believed we'd been missing for a century. It's not that simple, though, because here's what he admitted. He couldn't fully explain it. He was trapped in the same modern consciousness that created the problem in the first place. But he tried. He pointed to Sumer's use of Babylonian mathematics. The base 60 system seems random to us. We use base 10 because we have 10 fingers. Obvious, right? But 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Mathematically elegant in ways base 10 can't touch. Standard interpretation. Clever mathematicians noticed useful properties. Kramer's interpretation. What if base 60 wasn't a choice? What if it reflected how they actually perceived numerical relationships? What if their consciousness structured quantity differently than ours? He pointed to their astronomy. They tracked planetary movements with insane precision. Star charts accurate for millennia. Knowledge about planetary cycles that Europeans didn't rediscover until the Renaissance. Standard interpretation. Patient observers. Kramer's interpretation. What if they weren't just observing? What if they were perceiving these patterns more directly? He pointed to their technology. Irrigation systems of stunning sophistication, massive ziggurats, metallurgy, agriculture, urban planning, all appearing seemingly from nowhere around 4,500 BCE. And get this, the tablets describing gods granting knowledge. What if those weren't religious myths at all? What if they were describing sudden cognitive shifts that made certain technologies immediately obvious? But here's where it gets really dark. Kramer started looking at what happened to Sumer itself. The civilization collapsed around 2000 BCE. Conquered, cities abandoned, people scattered. Standard interpretation. Civilizations rise and fall. Sumer was just the first. Normal stuff. But Kramer noticed something in the tablets from Sumer's final centuries. Later texts were different, not just in content, in the quality of thought they represented. More concrete, more practical, less concerned with cosmic principles. It was like the civilization wasn't just politically collapsing, it was cognitively declining. Whatever mode of consciousness made early Sumer possible was fading. And the later Sumerians, they were writing like people who no longer understood their own ancestors' texts. The famous king list showed the same pattern. Early kings with impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. Later kings with normal lifespans. Standard interpretation. Mythology transitioning to history. Kramer's interpretation, a record of cognitive shift. What earlier Sumerians experienced as reign became something more limited, more normal, more like what later civilizations understood as kingship. In his final interview, weeks before his death, Kramer's voice was barely audible. I think Sumer's collapse wasn't a political event. It was a consciousness event. Something about how they experienced reality changed. And once it changed, they couldn't maintain their civilization. He leaned closer to the camera, eyes wet. We are their descendants, living in the aftermath of that change, trying to read their texts, but unable to understand them, because we're on the other side of the divide. What they buried with him. Samuel Noah Kramer died on November 26, 1990, 93 years old. His obituary celebrated his contributions to Assyriology, mentioned his translations, his books, his decades of achievement. They did not mention his late-life doubts. They did not discuss his final interviews. They did not acknowledge that the man who defined our understanding of Sumer had admitted that understanding might be fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The academic establishment moved on quietly, efficiently. His earlier translations stayed in textbooks. His interpretations kept shaping how Sumer was taught. The narrative he'd helped create and then tried to tear down remained intact. But here's the catch. Kramer's doubts didn't die with him. A small number of researchers in consciousness studies and cognitive anthropology started picking up where he left off, questioning whether ancient civilizations thought in fundamentally different ways. Some have started retranslating Sumerian texts, with Kramer's late insights in mind. The results were startling. Texts that seemed like religious myths become descriptions of consciousness as states. King lists become records of different modes of existence. None of this has reached mainstream academia. Too many careers built on established interpretations. But there's a deeper resistance. If Kramer was right, if the Sumerians possessed something we've lost, then our entire story changes. We think we're the pinnacle. Technology the ancients couldn't imagine, science, rationality. But what if the Sumerians weren't primitive? What if they had capacities we lack? What if progress means gaining some abilities while losing others? The tablets are still there in museums, in archives, covered with cuneiform we can technically read. But if Kramer was right, we're reading words while missing meanings, translating language while failing to translate consciousness. Before I die, please listen, he said. We have gotten this wrong, not the details, the whole framework. And until we admit that our modern consciousness might not be capable of understanding ancient consciousness, we will keep teaching a history that never happened and missing a truth we desperately need to recover. So, here's my question. Do you think we've lost something our ancestors had, or was Kramer simply wrong? Drop your theory in the comments. And if you want more forbidden history that the academic establishment doesn't want you to see, smash that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.